Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade, and we're already up to number 3. Only 104 to go. Oh, wow. The excitement is building incrementally, I might add. Well, what can we do? Number 3. Oh, my God. I could talk for hours about Symphony number 3, but I'm not going to, so don't worry. What an amazing little work this is. 16 minutes long with all the repeats. It's amazing. You know, I can't say often enough, these early Haydn symphonies, they're remarkable works. They're incredible works. He's inventing the symphonic style as we knew it. And there wasn't anybody who was doing what he was doing. And even in these small works, you can hear just how sophisticated and smart and expressive and intelligent and oh God, they're great. I can't even begin to tell you how exciting they are. I know. You think, oh, it's just a tiny little, early Haydn symphony. No. It's a mature masterwork. It really is. On a small scale, in a small space. But wow, this is Haydn's first symphony with 4 movements. That is to include a minuet. And that's going to tell us an awful lot about what's going to happen in terms of symphonic form, as well as the wonderful, wonderful effect it has in the context of this very symphony. Now, this may not have been Haydn's first symphony to use a minuet. This is, just number 3, which may not have been written in order. These are not chronologically ordered, but they're all in the first, decade or so. 5 years, 10 years, somewhere in there. It doesn't really make any difference. The point is that this is one of the most amazingly constructed pieces that anyone wrote of any period, ever, period, exclamation point. And I'm going to explain to you why. Now, like most of these symphonies, it's scored for just 2 oboes, 2 horns, strings, probably a bassoon, playing in the continuo part, because we believed the orchestras of those days had bassoons and they just played the bass line, whether the composers wrote them or not. And you do have a harpsichord continuo added in this performance. There's a big scholarly to-do about whether you should add keyboard music on the bottom of these pieces, because Haydn never wrote a single keyboard part except for Symphony number 98, which proves that you never had one, probably. Because none of the parts were ever written, and you can improvise something, which most performances these days, particularly the period instrument ones, tend to do. I happen to like them without the keyboard, because in my experience, although not in these performances, see, it's always a question of how well the performance does, isn't it? Often an over-prominent continuo part, an over-prominent keyboard part distracts from the color and the dynamic range that Haydn wrote into the music, because the keyboard, a harpsichord particularly, has no dynamic range, basically. And you wind up listening to the over-enthusiastic continuo player improvising what Haydn did not write, rather than the marvelous music that Haydn did write. But if you can do it tastefully, and here they do, I'm fine with it. So this is, the examples we're going to listen to come from the Symphony of Finlandia under Patrick Galois as part of the fabulous Naxos collection of the complete symphonies. And they did a lot of things. They did complete symphonies, the quartets, the piano sonatas, the concertos, the oratorios. They have a wonderful Haydn catalog. Anyway, let's talk about the Third Symphony. Now, what is there to know about the Third Symphony? First of all, the opening theme is in counterpoint. Counterpoint. It has 2 parts, a top and a bottom, and you can switch them. They can reverse at times. But the point about this is that the opening theme, or the opening motive, it's not really the theme. The theme is longer than this, but the motive consists of 4 long notes. So, easy enough, right? And I'm going to play you the entire exposition of the Third Symphony so you can hear the first subject with its 4 long notes. And then there's a very, very brief second subject. let me play it for you, and then we'll talk a little bit about it, and we'll see where this is going. All right? Because you just remember those four long notes. Some people have said that they sound somewhat like, the four notes in Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, which also show up in Haydn's symphony number. I talked about it. Which was it? I think 13 or 16, one of the early ones, or 12. I mean, we'll get to it, but I already don't remember. But I can find it if I need to. The point is that those four notes are just contrapuntal tags. In other words, they're building blocks, musical Legos. You use them to construct other things. And so the fact that it goes bum, 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 or bum, 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 or da, 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 as Mozart has it, and Haydn, doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference at all. The distinctiveness of the theme is not the point. Lots of composers use these ideas. What matters is what you make of them, and what Haydn is going to make of them, of the idea. These four notes in four long notes. That's all you need to know. What's going to happen to those four long notes is amazing, but it's not going to happen in the first movement. That's one of the things that makes the symphony so incredible. Anyway, listen to the exposition, and you'll see what I mean. Now, I've marked out the first subject with its four long notes and the second subject, which is a teeny, teeny dialogue between the two oboes and the strings. Very, very brief, extremely brief. And there's a reason for this. Haydn wants you to remember those four long notes, and he's not trying to take too much attention away from them. Now, the development section is remarkable. The development section has what I call an ouch moment. This is where Haydn starts to show you that the material that he's using is capable of great emotional expressiveness. And he does that in this case by creating a passage of really kind of remarkable dissonance. It's created by what they call suspensions, which means hanging on to the harmony of one chord as you move on to another one. And there's a natural clash between the two, and it creates an ouch moment. I mean, a moment of sort of pain and suffering. All of a sudden, it's quite shocking and startling. So I'm going to play you the entire development. Again, it's quite short. It's very, very brief, because development is going to happen all over the symphony. It's not just about the first movement. And the most amazing thing about this symphony is that the development that happens is unique to this symphony. And I want to talk more about that in a minute, but just listen to the development section. I will point out the ouch moment, but I'm sure you're going to hear it, for yourself. It's fairly obvious when it occurs. Here is the development section. Again, working with those four long notes for the most part. Here you go. I'm sure you heard exactly what I was talking about. Now, what I was talking about also was large-scale continuity. One of the things we talked about, for example, in the Second Symphony was how Haydn was able to create a symphony in 3 movements, in that case, where all the parts somehow related, and they related by using, in this case, trills, by using a musical idea that was common to all 3 movements, but he didn't have to actually repeat themes. And Haydn almost never repeats themes. That was a much later Romantic development where music became large and form became loose, and so composers used the recall of themes from one movement to a next to try and bind the whole thing together. Haydn's working on a much smaller scale. He can work with ideas, with concepts, and that's very different. So what are the ideas that we've heard in this movement? Really, there's only one. It's very simple that you need to know. Well, there are 2. Let's talk about 2. The first is 4 notes in long rhythm, and 4 long notes, and counterpoint. In counterpoint, that is a slow top with a quickly moving bottom, which is actually reversible. And the other thing is the ouch moment, the suspensions, the idea of using this dissonant harmony to create music of great poignancy and also surprise. And that is what we're going to hear, this second idea, the suspensions, the idea of poignancy in the second movement. Now, the second movement is for strings alone, and it's in a minor key, and it's full of pathos. It really is, but you don't really know where that pathos is going. It's very, very surprising, the harmonic shifts that Haydn pulls in this movement. And in order to illustrate that, I'm just going to play you the end of the movement, really the recapitulation. It has the same form, basically, as the first movement, which is sonata form, and it's quite developmental. It really is. There's a lot going on, but the thing that gets developed is that tremendously poignant use of harmony that really stood out in the development section of the first movement. So listen to the end of this, and again, you'll hear a few ouch moments. I think I'll point one out when you hear it. You can watch and see a little word will come up that says ouch, and you'll hear exactly where it is. But there are a couple of, there are a few of them. This is music of great darkness and emotional intensity. It's very surprising. Here you go. Listen to just the recapitulation of the movement. It's about 6 minutes long, the whole movement, with all the repeats. And it's really quite a remarkable little piece. Moving, isn't it? And deep. That's the kind of depth of emotion that's surprising and that, nobody really gives Haydn credit for having. Everyone says, well, he was cheerful. Well, yes, he was. He was very cheerful and funny. But he also was able to create a remarkable depth of expression using very, very simple means, as he does in this movement. But, one of the things about these early symphonies, as I said, is that they are not just frippery. They aren't just light, fluffy little, they were written at a period where the symphony was still very much a form of light entertainment. And although these are short and generally perky and certainly breezy, and they have their light moments, there are depths in them. And this movement really shows that, I think. I mean, if you listen to the whole thing, it's an incredibly moving piece of music, and one that has just an amazing amount of character and expressive intensity, especially given the style that Haydn was working in at the time. So that's the slow movement. Now, next we come to the minuet. Ah, the minuet. Haydn was the greatest minuet composer that ever lived. He wrote more than 1,000 of the little suckers, and so he better have been. He really was. Most composers treat the minuet like a minuet. In other words, it's a dance piece, right? But Haydn invented what we might call the symphonic minuet. Now, what makes it symphonic? In simplistic terms, what makes it symphonic is the fact that you can't dance to it. I mean, it would trip up the dancers in a minute. But what Haydn understood, and it's just another indication of his genius as a composer, that if you're going to write a minuet that you're not going to dance to, but you're going to listen to, it has to be interesting. It has to be worth listening to. You have to do something that's going to be ear-catching and say to you, first of all, A, it's a minuet, but B, it's not just any minuet. It's a special minuet. And this is the first in the numerical list of symphonies of Haydn's special minuets. He would write another 80 some odd more of them at some point or another in the symphonies alone. But this particular minuet is completely undanceable. Why? Well, a minuet, as you may know, is the predecessor of the waltz. It was an aristocratic dance in 3/4 time. It just went 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That's basically it. And when you do dance pieces of this type, they almost always fall into 4 and 8 bar phrases because dancers need the regularity of rhythm. It would be 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. You understand what I mean? They need that regularity to know where their feet are going. Well, the first phrase of this minuet is a 10-bar phrase that falls into 2 5-bar sections. And I'm going to indicate section 1, section 2, so you can hear where they are. Every phrase in this minuet, every musical sentence sounds either too long or too short. It never ends where you think it's going to. And within those phrases, the rhythm is often syncopated. That is, the beats don't fall in regular order on the first note of each bar. It's guaranteed to give the dancers hell, but it makes a wonderful minuet to listen to. Why? Because it always keeps you guessing. You understand that it's a dance, you hear the rhythm, but it's unpredictable. And it's that unpredictability that makes it so fabulous. So what the example that I'm going to play is, the minuets fall into A, B, A form, with each section, the A and the B section, having 2 halves, both repeated. So I've cut out the repeats just to save time. So you're going to hear the whole A section, and the first piece of it, the first half, is a 10-bar phrase, and then after that, it's anything goes. I mean, it's amazing. Just listen to it and let your expectations simply float free, and listen to what the music does in contrast to what you may think it should be doing, and you'll get a sense of just how remarkable this music is. Here is the entire A section of the minuet. Okay, so you see what I mean? You hear how just remarkable and quirky it is, even though it's a simple little dance. It's really rather cool what Haydn could do with such simple forms in such a small space, something that you would think is terribly restricting. But not with Haydn. With Haydn, nothing is restricting. Everything is cause for freedom and imagination. And that's what we hear. Now, the middle section of a minuet is called a trio. No one knows why it's called a trio. It has nothing to do with the number 3. Nothing at all. People have proposed various explanations for why the middle section of dance movements is called a trio, but so far none of them have been terribly convincing. Anyway, the middle section, the trio, also has 2 halves, both repeated, and I'm going to play just the whole thing. That is the second half of the first section and the first half of the second section, so you hear the complete thing once through. And in this case, the trio sections of Haydn's minuets are often places where he lets the woodwind players of his orchestra have a star turn. And that's what happens here. It's sort of a duet between the 2 oboes and the 2 horns. And it tells us something else about the way Haydn is going to write symphonies. You know, later in the 20th century, we started hearing pieces called concerto for orchestra, like Bartók's, for example, which is very famous. And the reason composers began writing concertos for orchestra is because what they really wanted to do was write symphonies. But they were so sort of intimidated by the symphonic tradition and by the crotchety attitude of pedantic critics and audiences about what a symphony ought to be, that they thought it best not to call anything that they did a symphony. So they called it concerto for orchestra. And what that meant is that the various sections of the orchestra all had soloistic moments. Well, Haydn was doing that from the very beginning. I mean, every single one of his symphonies is a concerto for orchestra. In the true sense of the term, he makes sure that everybody gets something to do and something to show off. And this is very, very different from the Baroque style, where you have all of the harmony stuffed into a continuo part and the accompanying strings, and everything else was a soloist all the time. In Haydn's symphonies, in the classical style, everyone is potentially a soloist, but no one is perpetually a soloist. And that's what made the classical style so remarkable, and what makes it possible, by the way, to get rid of continuo parts, because every instrument can either be a solo or accompaniment. And writing that way, learning how to use instruments that way, was one of Haydn's great accomplishments. It was one of the great accomplishments of composers more generally during this period. It's what they began to do. But in this trio, you hear very clearly, it's a solo turn for the wind players. So here it is. So much for the minuet. Now we get to the finale. Oh my God, what an amazing finale this is. What are its remarkable features? Well, there are quite a few, and I'm actually going to play you the whole thing. You're going to get a chance to hear a lot about this finale. It's a little tiny finale, less than 2 minutes long, about 1 minute and 53 seconds or so in this performance. First of all, it's through composed. It has no internal repeats. Second of all, it is really the development of the first movement. This is what's so incredible about this piece. When we talked about the second symphony, we talked, what are these qualities that allow Haydn to create a symphony which is a unity? Haydn always conceived his works whole. It was something he prided himself on. He told his biographers that. They quoted him. He always saw his works as unities, and was always thinking of ways to try and create that unity in a wonderfully imaginative way. In that respect, he was absolutely one of the most unique composers that ever lived. The idea of seeing music, seeing a multi-movement, 4-section piece as one unified creation with actually no shared thematic material, but with shared ideas, with things that tell you that this finale could only belong to this symphony and no other, because it does things that depend on what happened previously. And that action and reaction, that relationship between the elements of the work. It's what created the symphonic style. And Haydn really, really created it. It was Haydn's. It was no one else's. No one else's to the same degree in any case. And this symphony is the one that proves it. And we're only at symphony number 3. And that's what's so incredible about this, and why I keep saying to you folks and the world at large, don't underestimate Haydn's early symphonies. Now, what were the elements that we remember from the first movement? Well, there was the ouch moment, right, which we heard sort of developed in the second movement. And that was in itself a marvelous thing. In the finale now, what we have is the first idea, that is 4 notes, 4 long notes, and counterpoint underneath, a counter melody and faster notes underneath, which you can flip around, which is reversible. That's exactly what this finale is about. And it's not about anything else. It really isn't. In fact, I want to play you. I'm going to play you I made a little sort of excerpt bit so you can hear exactly what I mean. I'm going to play you the opening of the finale, and then I'm going to play you a bit of the development from the first movement, and you'll hear exactly what I mean. Because the themes are not the same. The 4 long notes are not the same. The counter melody, the fast part underneath or on top, depending on how you do it, is not the same. But the idea is the same. And this idea in the finale grows out of the one in the first movement as surely as dawn follows the night. It's absolutely indisputable that this finale is based on the same idea as that of the first movement. So here is, very briefly, the opening of the finale. And now listen to the opening of the development of the first movement. See what I mean? I mean, they are essentially the same idea, although they take a different shape and they sound differently. Why? Because Haydn wants to create the maximum amount of variety, and in this small space that he's working, within just, at this point, the symphony's gone on for about 14 minutes, you're going to remember what the first movement sounded like. You know what I mean? He doesn't have to quote the actual theme from the first movement, because you get the similarity immediately. So now let's listen to the entire finale. And then I'm going to talk about the finale itself a little bit. It's all over in less than 2 minutes, and it doesn't have to be longer, because it sounds like the development, the inevitable realization of the idea we heard in the first movement. And so he doesn't have to stretch it out and make it long. It has that finality just by virtue of being what it is, by virtue of it being that inevitable outcome of the question proposed in the first movement. So here is the entire finale. Isn't that incredible? I mean, it's incredible. I think it's incredible. It's mind-blowingly incredible. But the finale, in addition, and it does even more than that. I mean, all this in less than 2 minutes. In addition to simply being the outcome or the development or the inevitable conclusion to the idea proposed in the first movement, this finale has its own business to mind. It does its own thing. And what is the thing that it does? The thing is the music where you do not hear the 4 long notes, but rather it's doing other things. That is, modulating to other keys, going other places, full of action and rushing activity. That's what I called, in the discussion of the first symphony, motion music. The music which, in the sonata style that Haydn was working in, is dramatic. It's what gets you from one musical location to another musical location. And the motion music is extremely important in Haydn's music, in Mozart, and Beethoven, and most later composers, because that's where the action is. That's where the action happens. The themes, the melodies are little gems of expressive intensity within a key. And the motion music is what gets you from one key to the next gem of emotional expression in a different key. That's how the music works, essentially. And in this particular tiny little movement, there is a balance between counterpoint, that is the idea of this 4 long notes with quicker music on top or on bottom, that can be juxtaposed in various ways, and activity, action, drama. That's the juxtaposition. And this particular movement balances it out very, very beautifully. But what makes that so interesting, this juxtaposition between the severe style, the intellectual style, which is counterpoint, is that it not only elevates the entire symphonic concept here. I mean, there's more going on in this music than just happy, light, happiness, just lightness and diversion. It's actually an intellectual game that Haydn's playing to a certain degree, and people who have a certain level of musical sophistication will hear that. Others, you just enjoy it because it's fun, and you can leave it at that. But if you want to look deeper, the depth is there, and that is really important for later developments, because a lot of later music in Haydn, and particularly Beethoven, and particularly late Beethoven, is music about music. It's music about the contrast between the learned style, the rhetorical style, counterpoint, the contrapuntal style, and the sonata style, action and drama, and the tension between them. Beethoven's late quartets are all about that. Although, in Beethoven, you get an entire movement that's a fugue, then an entire movement in sonata form. Here, Haydn does exactly that sort of juxtaposition, but he does it in less than 2 minutes. But it's the same principle. And that's what I really want to emphasize here. One of the things about listening to these Haydn symphonies is that they will teach us about essential principles. What music is, the fabric of music, the materials of music, and how you work with them. And if you listen to these pieces and internalize them and come to love them, as I love them, and get to know them, they will set you up for all of the music that came later. I'm not kidding. They really do, because Haydn's working here with really first principles. And it's so wonderful to hear. And so that's sort of what I would like you to take away from this little talk about the Third Symphony. Haydn Symphony number 3, only number 3, the innocuous symphony in G major, number 3. It's not so innocuous. There are depths here, and they're going to be explored at greater length and, in more detail, and possibly with greater intensity in Haydn's later works and Mozart's later works and Beethoven's later works. But all of the elements are already in place, and you can hear them clearly in this little symphony. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you so much for joining me on this Haydn Symphony Crusade. I'll see you next time.